When my son David handed me a glossy brochure for a state nursing facility and slid a small duffel bag across the kitchen table, he believed he was finally removing the last inconvenience from his life. He stood there beside his wife Chloe, trying to look sympathetic. But the impatience in his eyes gave everything away. They thought I was old, slow, confused after surgery. They thought they could quietly pack me off to a care home, sell my estate, and step into the life they believed they deserved. What they didn't realize was that by the time they made their move, I had already removed their access to everything they planned to steal by 5 o'clock that evening. They wouldn't be planning luxury vacations or celebrating their sudden inheritance. They would be standing outside the iron gates of the property with nowhere to go, and the house they thought belonged to them would never open its doors again. But to understand how we reached that moment, you need to understand how carefully they believed they had played their game. 2 months earlier, I had a minor hip surgery. Nothing serious. Just a small procedure that required a few weeks of slower movement while I healed. I had spent 40 years building a commercial real estate company from nothing. Long hours, difficult deals, endless negotiations. I was used to solving problems on my own. But when David heard about the surgery, he and Chloe immediately insisted on moving in. "We'll take care of everything," he said. "You shouldn't be alone after something like that." It sounded generous on the surface, but the moment they arrived, their version of help became very clear. They didn't move into the main house with me. They moved straight into the 2-bedroom guest house beside the pool, the one with the marble kitchen, the private patio, and the panoramic garden view, rent-free, utilities included. And over the next 8 weeks, they treated the property like their personal resort. They hosted late-night pool parties with their friends, ordered expensive meals on my credit card, drove my second car into the city for dinners and shopping trips. Meanwhile, I hired a private nurse to help with the recovery they had promised to manage. I watched it all quietly. People assume quiet means unaware, but quiet people see everything. One evening near sunset, I was sitting on the back patio with a cup of tea when I heard their voices through the open kitchen window of the guest house. They didn't know I was outside. Chloe's voice carried clearly through the warm evening air. "She's basically a vegetable now, David," she said with a dismissive laugh. "She can barely make it to the mailbox without that walker." David chuckled softly. "She'll recover eventually." Chloe poured a glass of wine. "I'm not waiting for that. If we move fast, we don't have to." There was a pause. Then she lowered her voice. "If we get her declared incompetent, we can move her into evils. It's cheap, it's understaffed, and no one asks questions there. Once we have power of attorney, we sell the house and everything attached to it." David hesitated. "But the estate is in her name." "Not if we control her paperwork," Chloe replied smoothly. "You're her only child. Judges approve guardianships all the time when someone's elderly and recovering from surgery." The ice in my tea glass stopped halfway to my lips. "She won't even understand what's happening," Chloe continued casually. "And by the time she figures it out, the house will already be sold." David exhaled slowly. $3 million in property alone, he said quietly. "And that's before the investment accounts," Chloe added. The two of them clinked wine glasses. "To our future." I sat there in silence long after their conversation ended. For a moment, I waited for grief to come, for heartbreak, for anger. But instead, something else arrived. Clarity. Sharp, immediate. Absolute. My son had already decided my future for me. He just hadn't realized I still had control over it. The next morning I called my attorney. By Friday afternoon, the estate was no longer legally mine. And by Tuesday morning, David and Chloe finally made their move. They entered the dining room together, Chloe wearing that practiced, sympathetic expression, David avoiding my eyes. He placed the duffel bag on the table first, then the brochure. Pine Hills Care Facility. Had heard of it before. Underfunded. Overcrowded. The kind of place families used when they wanted someone forgotten quickly. David cleared his throat. "Mom?" he began carefully. "We've been thinking about your recovery." Chloe stepped closer. placing a hand on my shoulder like an actress rehearsing concern. "We just want what's best for you," she said sweetly. David slid the brochure toward me. "We arranged a room at It has full-time staff and medical supervision. The transport van will arrive in about an hour." I looked down at the cheap brochure, the duffel bag beside it, and the real estate agent's car pulling slowly into the driveway outside the window. They had scheduled everything perfectly, or so they believed. Chloe leaned closer. "Don't worry about the house," she whispered. "We'll handle selling it to cover your care expenses." They both watched me closely, waiting, expecting tears, or panic, or pleading. Instead, I finished my tea, folded my napkin neatly, and stood up from the table. "I see," I said, calmly. David blinked in confusion. "You understand?" "Yes." I picked up my purse. "I'll take my own car." They looked stunned. They had prepared themselves for resistance, not cooperation. As I walked out the front door, the realtor stepped out of his car, holding a folder of paperwork. Perfect timing. I smiled politely as I passed him. Then I got in my car and drove away. But I didn't drive to Pine Hills. I drove to the Four Seasons and waited. Part 2. It took 45 minutes for the phone to ring. I had just finished ordering strawberries and tea from room service when David's name appeared on the screen. When I answered, he wasn't calm anymore. He sounded like someone who had just discovered the ground disappearing beneath his feet. "Mom," he gasped. "What did you do?" I leaned back in the hotel chair and looked out across the city skyline. "Good afternoon, David." The realtor just pulled the county records. He continued breathlessly. "The house isn't in your name anymore. It says it belongs to something called the Obsidian Horizon Trust." He took a slow bite of a strawberry. "That is correct." There was silence on the line for a moment, then panic. "But we're trying to sell the house. I'm aware. You can't just move property like that." I smiled slightly. "I already did." He began pacing somewhere in the background. "You have to transfer it back," he said desperately. "The sale is already being prepared." "Unfortunately, that won't be possible." "Why not?" "Because the trust is irrevocable." The word landed like a stone. Irrevocable. Meaning permanent. Meaning untouchable. David's breathing grew heavier. "But we live here," he said weakly. "Do you?" "Yes." Opened the trust document, resting beside my tea. "Interesting," I said calmly. "Because according to the property agreement, unauthorized occupants are considered trespassers." Silence. Then a new voice appeared in the background. "Chloe, what's happening?" she demanded. David covered the phone briefly, but I could still hear the panic in his voice. "She transferred everything to a trust." Chloe grabbed the phone. "Eleanor," she said sharply, dropping the fake kindness entirely. "Stop playing games. We're listing the house today." "No," I replied quietly. "You can't stop us. I already have." There was a pause. Then Chloe laughed nervously. "You're bluffing." Right on cue, my attorney arrived at the estate. I could hear the commotion through the phone as the security vehicles pulled into the driveway. "Who are those people?" Chloe demanded suddenly. "That would be Mr. Sterling," I said calmly. "My attorney." "What? And the property security team?" The line went silent for a moment. Then shouting, "What do you mean we have 24 hours? Chloe yelled somewhere in the background. David grabbed the phone again. "Mom? They're saying we're unauthorized tenants." "That's correct. But we live here. You were visiting. This is insane." "No," I said softly. "What you tried to do was insane." His voice dropped. "You planned this." "No," I replied calmly. "You did." Silence filled the line. Then the quiet sound of gates closing in the background. That evening, just before 5 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time, it was Mr. Sterling. "They've packed their belongings," he reported, "in the vehicles. Removed. The trust has reclaimed all property assets." I thanked him and hung up. Later that night, I received a final voicemail from David. For the first time in years. He sounded small. "Mom, please call me." I didn't. Some lessons require silence. Because the truth is, They didn't try to send me to a care home because they were worried about my health. They tried to send me away because they thought I was weak. They mistook quiet for helplessness. They mistook patience for ignorance. But the quietest people in a room are usually the ones paying the closest attention. And sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't anger, it's preparation. That evening I finished my tea, looked out at the city lights, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace, because the house I built, the life I created, and the future they tried to steal was never theirs to take in the first place. When I hung up the phone, the hotel room became very quiet again. Outside the tall glass windows, the late afternoon sun was slowly fading behind the skyline. The city looked calm, almost peaceful. But somewhere across town, chaos had just begun. Could imagine the scene perfectly. The realtor standing awkwardly in the driveway. David, staring at the property records in disbelief. Chloe pacing across the marble floor of the guest house, trying to argue with my lawyer. For years they believed they were the smartest people in every room. That illusion was about to collapse. My phone rang again. This time it was my attorney, Mr. Sterling. His voice was calm, professional, and slightly amused. "Good afternoon, Eleanor?" "Good afternoon. I just arrived at the property, and..." There was a brief pause. "Well, your son appears to be having a very difficult afternoon." I allowed myself a small smile. "Has he seen the documents?" "Yes." "And Chloe?" "Oh, she read them twice." Mr. Sterling continued. "I explained that the entire estate is now held by the Obsidian Horizon Trust. The main house, the guest house, the vehicles, the investment accounts, everything." And their reaction. He chuckled softly. "Let's just say they did not expect that outcome." I leaned back in the chair and looked out over the city again. "Have you given them the notice?" "Yes." "And 24 hours to vacate the guest house?" "Exactly as planned." You see, David and Chloe had assumed something very important. They believed they were already living in a house that belonged to them. But they never signed a lease. They never paid rent. And once the estate moved into the trust, their legal status changed instantly. From family members to unauthorized occupants. In simpler terms, TRESPASSERS. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. "Security has arrived as well." "Good. Because I knew Chloe well enough to expect a scene. She's demanding to speak with you," he added. I laughed quietly. "That would not be productive." "Understood." We ended the call. Then I finished my tea and watched the sun slowly sink behind the buildings. The rest of the story unfolded exactly the way I expected. At 3:30 p.m., David called again. This time he sounded different. Not arrogant, not confident. Just, "Scared, Mom, please pick up." I answered. "What is it, David?" "They're serious," he said quickly. "The lawyer. The security. They're saying we have to leave." "That is correct." "But, we live here." "No," I replied calmly. "You were visiting." "We've been here for 2 months." "Yes, but the property belongs to the trust now." Silence. Then his voice broke slightly. "Why would you do this to us?" That question surprised me, because he still didn't understand. "I didn't do this to you," I said quietly. "You did it to yourselves." Chloe grabbed the phone again. Her voice was sharp and furious. "You think you're clever, don't you?" "I think I listened carefully," I replied. "You tricked us." "No. You revealed yourselves." There was shouting in the background. Security. Asking them to remain calm. A car. Engine starting somewhere in the driveway. Chloe lowered her voice. "You can't just throw us out like this." "I didn't. You planned to put me in a care home this morning." She went silent. The truth is very heavy when someone is forced to hear it out loud. After a moment, David spoke. Again. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You heard that? Conversation." "Yes. When?" 8 weeks ago." Another long silence. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "Mom, I'm sorry. But apologies that arrive after betrayal usually come too late." Because trust is not something you rebuild with a sentence. It is built over years, and destroyed in a single moment. David, I said gently, you didn't think I deserved dignity in my own home. That's not true. You packed my suitcase. He had no answer. So I ended the call at 5 p.m., exactly. My phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Sterling. The property is secure. Gates locked. I imagined the final scene clearly. David and Chloe standing outside the iron gates of the estate. There. Suitcases beside them. The luxury cars they had been driving already. Towed away by the trust's management. The credit cards tied to my accounts declining. When they tried to book a hotel, the same helpless feeling they expected me to experience that morning. Only now it belonged to them. That evening, I ordered dinner to my hotel room, and watched the city lights flicker on across the skyline. For the first time in weeks, the tension in my chest disappeared, not because of revenge, but because of clarity. Family should never feel like a transaction, and love should never depend on inheritance. My son had mistaken patience for weakness. He believed silence meant surrender. But the quietest people in the room are often the ones listening most carefully, and sometimes the strongest move you can make is not an argument, not a confrontation, just preparation. Because when someone shows you exactly who they are, the smartest thing you can do is believe them the first time.